Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in existentialism. We're continuing our examination of Friedrich Nietzsche in this video, focusing on arguably the most important part of his philosophy, this being the idea of nihilism. We'll explain what nihilism is, how it is derived, and what it fundamentally means for somebody like Nietzsche, who was not only an existentialist, or would to an extent fall into the realm of existentialism, but who too was something of a nihilistic interpreter of, of reality, shall we say. Um, it is one of the most important and well-known Nietzschean contributions to philosophy, the idea of nihilism. Now, this is not necessarily a determinative, objective thing. Some people might say that there are other elements that are more akin to being the most important Nietzschean contributions to philosophy, but I would argue that nihilism is one of them. Whenever I think of Friedrich Nietzsche, I tend to associate Nietzsche with nihilism. Prior to researching this topic and researching existentialism, I actually had very little exposure to Friedrich Nietzsche, even during a philosophy degree. But still, nevertheless, Nietzsche still strikes me as a nihilist, or at least nihilism strikes me as one of the most important contributions that Nietzsche actually proposes. We'll explain what the concept of nihilism is from the Nietzschean perspective in this lesson, look at the implications of such concepts, as well as some of the formulations of nihilism, talking, for example, about epistemological nihilism as one such example. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche himself would probably describe nihilistic philosophy as, quote, the highest values devaluing themselves. This is quite a philosophical and quite an abstract way of explaining it. What does this actually mean? Well, ultimately, nihilism is a group of views that exists within philosophy that looks to and seeks to reject some of the most core and fundamental beliefs which make up human existence, such as knowledge, morality, and, for our important purposes, meaning. Of course, existentialism is an area of philosophy which concerns meaning to quite a high degree. We've done this when we focused on looking at, firstly, Soren Kierkegaard. We've talked about it in relation to Friedrich Nietzsche, and we will talk about it in relation to other existentialist philosophers in the future, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. A nihilistic interpretation of existentialism would therefore argue that life is devoid of meaning, that there is a lack of meaning, there is a devaluing of meaning itself. Contrary to popular interpretation, Nietzsche himself, while associated with nihilism, and even in my conception of understanding Nietzsche, I always associate him with nihilism, he was far from a nihilist himself, but rather makes the argument that it is the values we have in society that the society itself holds that are nihilistic instead. So, what does he believe about values which are essentially nihilistic? Well, one such example of his view specifically is which he holds to be anti-life. The idea that some other world which is utopic in nature, something like heaven as found in religious doctrine. Okay, so this is an understanding of what he would describe as anti-life. Nietzsche rejects this interpretation and in fact argues that there ought to be the aggressive acceptance of the world in which we live in. So what he views what he rejects, okay, is views that are considered to be, quote, anti-life. And one such example of this is the idea of there being some other world which is utopic in nature, something like heaven as found in religious doctrines. He believes that or at least argued that beliefs in things like heaven, in things like utopian societies that don't exist in reality, should not exist. These are, or at least should not be considered. These are anti-life ideas, and rejects this interpretation, arguing that there ought to be instead the aggressive acceptance of the world that we live in, which is something of a Stoic interpretation, if you will. There is certain Stoicism in that kind of understanding of Nietzsche, understanding that essentially what Stoicism Nihilism ascribes to is this view that there is an aggressive acceptance, or you ought to aggressively accept what happens to you and not let this get to you in any particular way. And this could be seen in his influences. So we noted some of Nietzsche's influences from the previous lesson, but it's worth examining some of them here in relation to nihilism. The vast number of German scholars in and around the time at which Nietzsche was writing and living, they were heavily influenced by ancient Greek, and specifically, of course, ancient Greek philosophers. And what is interesting here is, specifically about Nietzsche, is that he was not particularly interested in the lesser known, the more popular works of ancient Greek philosophy, the Platos and the Aristotles. He was particularly interested in the works of the lesser-known ancient Greeks. So less so Socrates and Plato, more so Heraclitus and Thucydides, for example, or Heraclitus and Empedocles, all of which are the sort of described as the pre-Socratic philosophers, of which we have made a number of lessons on the Philosophy Academy already. And so, really, one of the writers that I've just mentioned, Heraclitus, was somebody who was influencing Nietzsche to a great extent. He was fascinated with some of the works and some of the writings of Heraclitus, partially owing to the fact that some of Heraclitus' writings were particularly dark in terms of its character. For example, in his work, The Birth of Tragedy, he argued that, quote, only as aesthetic phenomenon can the world be justified. This kind of thinking and attitude will be something that we'll come back to in future lessons. One of the lesser-known counterparts to a nihilistic interpretation of reality, or a nihilistic interpretation of existentialism, is this understanding known as epistemological nihilism. Now, what Nietzsche appears to support is a view of nihilism about knowledge. So he supports a view of nihilism which would be epistemological in question. This is the view that there is no such thing as truth. And so as a result of this, there being no truth, truths are only errors that we can give up. Being something of an epistemological skeptic in a way, this is what Nietzsche believed, at least, or at least it seems to be something he believed. But he seems to be more than just somebody who is skeptical of epistemology, or skeptical of what we believe to be true, or what we could know to be true. He seems, for example, to suggest that there does not exist a certain amount of perspectivism, the view that all our knowledge of the world is to be experienced and understood through personal perspective. Now, the view of epistemological nihilism, therefore, requires an adherence to the view that there is no such thing as an objective fact, there's no such thing as a moral fact, equally there is no such thing necessarily of a scientific fact. Instead, things which seem to be objective are actively instead perspectively determined. So things like mathematical truths and scientific claims that seem on their face, at least prima facie, to be something of an objective standard, these are seen as perspectively determined according to somebody like Nietzsche.